rebels stormed the Capitol building in a bloody revolt.
In the early 2000s, certain revolutions occurred with questionable authenticity, all ending up with a suspiciously US-friendly outcome each time. Obviously, the US was deeply involved, but how did they do it? Let's take a look into the US's Color Revolution playbook. What is a color revolution? Simply a regime change caused, orchestrated, funded, and strongly supported by powerful foreign actors, usually the United States. Color revolutions usually begin with disputed elections in countries whose institutions, to quote them, struggle to handle mass unrest. They're mostly nonviolent, usually because of the speed at which things are pre-prepared to happen, but despite being praised as democratic breakthroughs, they often just reshuffle power to suit the interests of this or that foreign policy and the capital that drives it. Usually, mass protests adopt symbolic colors or branding that unifies supporters and captures media attention, which present externally influenced movements as grassroots democratic campaigns, complete with protest signs in English despite English fluency in these countries being normally quite low, to say the least. Since emerging in the post-Cold War era as a strategy to destabilize enemy governments, these revolutions have been promoted as democracy building, particularly by the US, but that itself betrays that they're usually not. Even if external assistance looks minimal, it can be decisive, often through media manipulation, covert funding for opposition groups, and other soft power mechanisms like NGOs, sanctions, international broadcasts, so on and so forth. Back to the video in just a second, let's hear from today's sponsor, Fume. Have you ever caught yourself reaching for a bad habit? Well, now there's a better option. A fresh alternative that's satisfying and guilt-free. Meet Fume. Fume is not a vape, nor is it a pipe. It's an award-winning flavored air device that draws flavor into your mouth, not your lungs, making a healthier alternative to vaping. With a variety of flavors, from crisp mint to black licorice, Fume offers plenty for every taste, without the harmful effects. That's right, no vapor and no nicotine. And here's what makes Fume even better. It's not just about flavor, it's a fidget tool with satisfying magnets and clicks to keep your hands busy and calm your anxiety. With solid design and build, Fume is also easy to carry wherever you go. Switching to Fume doesn't just help your health, it saves your wallet too. Cheaper than a bad habit with no batteries or chargers. Ready to join over 300,000 people building better habits? Use my code Hakeem at checkout. And if you order the Journey Pack, you'll get a free Fume topper, an awesome accessory to enhance your Fume device. Visit tryfume.com/Hakeem or scan the QR code on your screen to start your journey now. That's tryfume.com/Hakeem, and don't forget to use my code for your exclusive offer. Sponsors have been scarce recently, so extra thanks to Fume for the sponsorship and allowing me to pay my editor fairly. Alright, back to the video. The Color Revolution playbook usually follows 6 simple steps to undermine governments that dare stray from the American line. Economic warfare is usually the first strike. Sanctions, trade restrictions, full embargoes, and powerful Western-controlled international financial institutions aimed at creating hardship in the nation targeted. For example, in Nicaragua, the US exerted pressure on the IMF, World Bank, and Inter-American Development Bank to withhold loans from the Sandinista government, while simultaneously destroying critical infrastructure through covert operations like the CIA bombing of a major fuel depot in Nicaragua's port of Corinto. Similarly, in Chile, during Salvador Allende's short presidency, the US cut off economic assistance and encouraged American corporations to deny Chile essential goods, such as replacement parts for buses, taxis, and production machinery, which greatly affected the critical Chilean copper, steel, and oil industries. The chokehold the US had on Chile led to shortages of basic necessities like flour, cooking oil, soap, and toilet paper. There were even shortages of bed sheets and cigarettes. All this economic deprivation had its intended effect of fueling public dissatisfaction. In Grenada, economic sanctions were used to punish the government and lay the groundwork for more direct intervention. Behind closed doors, regional leaders, under US influence of course, were persuaded to request American military intervention, paving the way for regime change. Next, and arguably the second most potent weapon after military force, is propaganda. Control over the media narrative is crucial to pulling off a regime change successfully. The US does this in 2 ways. The first is simply amplifying opposition narratives and figures, whether real or imagined, while simultaneously framing targeted governments as authoritarian, corrupt, or oppressive. This propaganda campaign is often orchestrated through extensive CIA-backed media operations, like Voice of America. For example, in Chile, the CIA funneled millions into anti-communist propaganda campaigns during Eduardo Frei's presidential run that used scare tactics, fabricated stories, and disinformation to discredit Allende and Chile's socialist movement. The second method the US uses involves directly inserting their media into mainstream outlets. The best example of this involves the United Fruit Company. During their campaign against Guatemala's reformist government, they employed the father of modern advertising, Edward Bernays, to direct a massive propaganda effort that involved placing articles in prominent newspapers like the New York Times depicting Guatemala as an oppressive Marxist dictatorship. This infamous campaign influenced both the public policymakers to view fairly conservative land reforms in Guatemala as inherently communist, and therefore evil. These narratives, reinforced by members of Congress, the domestic and international press, manufactured consent to take action against the unwanted government. The third step is funding and, let's say, empowering the target nation's opposition groups, no matter what those groups stand for, so long as they submit to the US. A good failed recent example is the US handpicked, wildly unpopular Venezuelan opposition politician Juan Guaido, who, despite not winning any legitimate elections, was recognized as president by dozens of US-aligned nations along with the US as president of Venezuela, over the legitimate government of Venezuela. This farce was finally ended in 2021 when it was clear beyond all doubt that Guaido was an American puppet, afterwards going to exile at the Gusano capital of the world, which is Miami. Sadly, the US is frequently more successful than this. Regardless, these operations are often conducted through organizations like USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, which provide the necessary resources to anti-government factions. In Chile, the CIA funded a Jesuit priest named Roger Vekemans, who had a network of organizations that funneled revolutionary energy into US-aligned actions. This not only influenced elections, but also fragmented more radical movements that threatened the status quo. Beyond financial aid, opposition groups are often armed and trained to serve as the vanguard of regime change. The CIA equipped exiled Guatemalan opposition leaders with weapons and other military resources to stage a coup against President Jacobo Arbenz. The operation was simple: hire American pilots to bomb Guatemala City, which will spread chaos, confusion, and anger amongst the populace, which the Guatemalan military can use as a pretext to overthrow the government. Step 4. By organizing protests and demonstrations, the US creates the appearance of widespread popular discontent, also known as astroturfing. These movements are usually funded and guided by covert operatives who then leverage grassroots organizations, international NGOs, and local activists to support US interests. In Nicaragua, the National Endowment for Democracy provided funding to local civic organizations and political coalitions like UNO, which received grants under the guise of promoting pro-democracy initiatives. These resources were then used to orchestrate large-scale demonstrations and paint a picture of nationwide unrest. A failed example of such an event would be the Cuban protests of 2021, which, despite significant US efforts at mobilizing everything from US-backed civic groups, quote-unquote, to hip-hop artists, managed to bring an insignificant amount of people into the streets. That did not stop American and other Western online media from knowingly using images from large pro-government demonstrations and portraying them as anti-government. Cheeky. In Bulgaria, US support for student protests offers another example. The NED financed the Federation of Independent Student Associations, which supplied the movement with loudspeakers, printing tools, and video systems to spread their message with a variety of media. Some protests burned communist-era textbooks and flags, which created potent imagery for international media to amplify. The ruse worked, of course. Sympathy abroad generated enough pressure on domestic leaders to see several key resignations within the Bulgarian government. Step 5 is where the use of force becomes the primary tool to effect change. Neutralizing a government security force is absolutely essential for any regime change operation to succeed. In most cases, the US seeks out key military and political figures, either through bribery, threats, or outright assassination. In Chile, the assassination of General René Schneider serves as a chilling example. A constitutionalist, Schneider opposed any attempt to subvert Chile's democratic process to remove Allende. His murder was orchestrated by the CIA, which supplied weapons to Chilean military officers that planned and executed the attack. This marked the beginning of the end of the Allende government, which was officially overthrown not long after. Similarly, in Guatemala, the CIA employed psychological and physical violence to make the military do its bidding and overthrow Arbenz. This strategy involved creating a climate of fear through staged violence, bombing, and spreading disinformation, which aimed to portray the government as incapable of maintaining control and safety. By undermining trust in the targeted government, the US creates a power vacuum that opposition military leaders could then easily fill. Dividing and conquering security forces is one of the most effective tools for toppling a government without, as Americans like to say, boots on the ground. Now that the loyal security forces have toppled the government, it is time for the sixth and final stage in the regime change: consolidating power under a new regime friendly with the US. In Chile, after Allende was overthrown, the US provided intelligence and resources to the new military dictatorship under General Pinochet to make absolutely certain he would align his interests with those of the US. During the coup, US naval and aerial operations that, while avoiding direct involvement, created an intimidating presence to give the military the confidence needed to follow through with seizing power. In Guatemala, Operation Success exemplifies the sophistication of US efforts to install a pro-American government. The operation began with a propaganda campaign designed to destabilize the Arbenz administration, followed by military operations disguised as a popular uprising. The selection of an opposition leader among Guatemalan exiles ensured that the new government would prioritize US corporate and political interests, particularly those of the United Fruit Company. Now that we've seen how they've done it before, how about we look at a few examples? This section is not a commentary on if this or that government is good, it's just a commentary on how the US government attempts to undermine them through this playbook. I've covered this particular coup in detail here, but read this short summary for an overview before we continue. Now let's take a look at how the US is trying to do the same stuff in Iran today. The US has been imposing sanctions targeting Iran's oil exports and financial systems for decades now, which has caused severe economic strain. However, it was under the Bush administration that these measures began to isolate Iran from global markets and have the crippling effect on Iran's economy that it does today. Unfortunately, limited access to essential foreign technologies has caused poor management of oil production, which, as their most lucrative export, further compounded the crisis. In 2006, the US passed the Iran Freedom Support Act, which explicitly provided funding for anti-regime media and NGO initiatives under the guise of promoting democracy, while leveraging human rights abuses to undermine the regime's legitimacy. Sadly, even if it is condemning actual human rights abuses, it rings hollow coming from the US given, well, all of their own innumerable human rights abuses, including participation in the genocide of the Palestinian people and the unending murder of minorities on American streets by US police. The US has been empowering opposition groups like the MEK, or what's left of the Pahlavi family, which have struggled to make any meaningful impact due to their lack of popular support, despite their wealthy benefactor. The US has also attempted to exploit ethnic differences and existing divisions by supporting separatist movements amongst Kurds and Baluchis. The US government has attempted to amplify Iranian protests through statements and initiatives, of course, like providing internet access to Iran using SpaceX Starlink satellites during internet blackouts during some protests. Interesting to note that Palestinians have never gotten this privilege from the oh-so-human rights-concerned American government. They also make sure to broadcast the same anti-regime propaganda they heavily fund on platforms like Voice of America and BBC Persian, in order to encourage people to flood the streets in protest, and then use these astroturfed protests to reinforce propaganda in Iran and abroad. The Bush administration greatly expanded US covert operations in Iran to $400 million, including support for minority insurgent groups, targeting Revolutionary Guard officials, and conducting cross-border raids. While it's true that everything I just talked about does map well onto the playbook, there's actually a document produced by the Brookings Institute in 2009 called The Path to Persia, which lays out in detail a set of policy recommendations that have an uncanny resemblance to this playbook. Let's go through them, shall we? Chapter 1. An offer Iran shouldn't refuse. Persuasion. Goals. Iran to give up its nuclear ambitions and support for extremist groups through a combination of incentives and punitive measures. Chapter 2. Tempting Tehran. The engagement option. Goals. Foster cooperation by eliminating punitive measures and building trust through dialogue and reassurance. These recommendations are part of the Iran deal that Obama managed. Chapter 3. Going all the way. Invasion. Goals. Overthrow the Iranian regime and ensure long-term compliance through military occupation. Jesus Christ. Thankfully, this hasn't happened yet, but various people in multiple US regimes have mused about it, and some still strongly lobby for it. Chapter 4. The Osirak option. Airstrikes. Goals. Destroy Iran's nuclear facilities to delay its nuclear program without regime change. Chapter 5. Leave it to Bibi. Allowing or encouraging an Israeli military strike. Goals. Let Israel take the lead in military action to shield the US from direct involvement. Chapter 6. The Velvet Revolution. Supporting a popular uprising. Goals. Facilitate regime change through domestic unrest and popular movements. Chapter 7. Inspiring an insurgency. Supporting Iranian minority and opposition groups. Goals. Destabilize the regime by empowering ethnic and political opposition groups. Anytime something happens in Iran that causes mass protests, you can be sure the US will be there to support it and amplify their message. Unfortunately for the US, their investment in the various opposition militias, or insurgents as they like to call them, has had a pretty low return on investment. Chapter 8. The Coup. Supporting a military move against the regime. Goals. Replace the current leadership through a military-led coup. Again, like Chapter 3, this hasn't happened yet, but unlike Chapter 3, the US has done this already earlier in Iran's history. And now we've come to the final chapter. Chapter 9. Accept the unacceptable. Containment. Goals. Manage and mitigate the threats posed by Iran's regime rather than eliminating them. This actually just describes the default policy that kind of serves as the basis for dealing with Iran. Before we move on to our next example though, it's important to point out here that the US has followed 7 of the 9 recommendations almost to the letter, all since 2009. That's because these think tanks are staffed by convenient military-industrial complex heads and political pundits that streamline it as policy directives to be delivered and rubber-stamped by Congress. It's a farce of a political process used to lightly obscure just how much American foreign policy serves the interests of this section of capital. For more about Iran, check out my dedicated video here. Let's move on to our second example, the Russia of the 1990s. After the Soviet Union's illegal dissolution in 1991, a small group of elites took control of Russia's most valuable resources, including oil, gas, and metals, creating one of the largest wealth transfers in modern history. By 1997, 5 of these individuals ranked among the world's richest billionaires, with their numbers growing to 17 the following year. You know them as the oligarchs. The government implemented shock therapy, removing price controls and privatizing state assets. These reforms were fully supported by their Western, mostly US, advisors, but failed to realize, or didn't care, that they were just converting state monopolies into private ones, with no significant operational changes, aside from the wealth generated from these industries going into private hands now instead of to the mass of society like it used to under the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the contribution of small businesses to the economy dropped to only 10 to 30% of GDP, far below Western levels. The economic fallout was catastrophic. The economy shrank by nearly 50%, hyperinflation wiped out pretty much all savings, poverty rates soared. You've heard this story before. I've covered the entire ordeal more deeply in my earlier video on Russia here. Yeltsin was framed as the father of Russian democracy by Western media. This same father of democracy ordered tanks to destroy Russia's parliament in 1993, effectively dismantling the constitutional system. The communist government never did anything even remotely similar at any time. Despite this authoritarian behavior, Western governments and media supported him and portrayed the crackdown as necessary for stability. The 1996 presidential election revealed the full extent of media manipulation and scheming by the Clinton administration, with Yeltsin to help each other during their respective elections. With financial backing from oligarchs and overwhelming Western support, Yeltsin secured his office in a rigged election despite record low approval ratings and rampant legal violations, all in an attempt to prevent the Communist Party from winning. Since the ascendancy of Putin and the stabilization of Russia as a geopolitical player, the US has begun likewise funding separatist movements and supporting this or that political opposition in hopes of bringing the 90s era of instability back. The Rand report, extending Russia competing from advantageous ground, is the same old playbook: sanctions that punish civilians, military maneuvers to provoke adversaries, and propaganda to undermine governments that don't fall in line. The US's backing of Syrian rebel groups is a stark example of the destruction this approach creates. It wasn't about democracy or stability, ever. It was about toppling a government that didn't fit Washington's agenda, no matter how much suffering it caused or how much chaos it unleashed. This report was published in 2019, and all the articles show US actions since then. Read them for yourself. Practically every single thing on this list has happened, is happening, or is in the process of being planned. Again, it seems like US policy is not being written by legislators but by think tanks like the Rand Corporation and the Brookings Institute. US sanctions against Venezuela have spanned 3 administrations, Obama, Trump, and Biden, targeting the Maduro government under the dubious guise of addressing human rights violations and restoring democracy, the typical line. These sanctions include restrictions on Venezuela's oil sector, reactivated in 2024 after being briefly eased. General License 44, which has allowed Venezuela to trade oil internationally, was rescinded ahead of the 2024 elections, which was a significant escalation in US intervention, seemingly timed to help bolster Kamala Harris's failed presidential run. Sanctions began in 2015 under the Obama regime with the Venezuelan Defense of Human Rights and Civil Society Act, which targeted high-ranking officials accused of repressing anti-government protests. Trump's regime expanded these measures in 2017, imposing restrictions on financial transactions with the Venezuelan government and contributing to them defaulting on their debt that same year. By 2024, the Biden regime reinstated harsh oil sanctions, undermining what remained of Venezuela's struggling economy while exempting US companies like Chevron from suffering the consequences of those sanctions. US media and government officials have strongly supported Venezuelan opposition figures, amplifying their questionable claims of electoral fraud and economic mismanagement under Maduro's government. Western media coverage of Venezuela heavily favors the opposition, portraying opposition leaders like Gonzalez and Machado as symbols of hope and change, very original, with their claims taken as gospel and their programs broadcasted uncritically by the American press. This is of course after either ignoring or casting doubt on the many extensively documented US-backed coup attempts against the Venezuelan government going back over 2 decades now. Protests of dubious organization, with evidence of astroturfing, have become a persistent feature of Venezuelan politics. That's not to say some protests aren't organic, but the evidence of American involvement is overwhelming. The US has given financial and other material support to so-called civil society groups through US aid to fund hundreds of projects aimed at promoting democratic stability and bolstering opposition leaders. In recent years, this funding has been repurposed to enhance access to objective information, which Americans themselves lack, and encourages citizen participation in an attempt to ensure US interests guide Venezuelan domestic affairs. If this doesn't sound problematic to you, imagine if Russia or Mexico did this in the US, or in your country. I've covered in detail the NATO bombing of Libya and the overthrow of Gaddafi in this video here, so if you want more details you can check that, but here's an overview. Pause if you're interested. So, what can we glean from all of this? Economic disruptions, media manipulation, and the strategic funding of opposition forces merges to create a soft power alternative to direct military confrontation. Sanctions weaken targeted economies, depriving governments of vital revenue streams and inciting public unrest. Essential imports are denied and financial institutions are pressured to withhold loans. The resulting shortages that primarily harmed ordinary people then paved the way for coups that have the appearance of being domestically generated. These tactics often happen in parallel with covert intelligence efforts that can't be understated. The media systematically amplifies opposition figures of dubious origins and popularity. Support for anti-government militias or exiled groups creates the opportunity for armed leverage that complements economic blockades. Even when violence remains a last resort, the threat of violence can often be just as potent. Publicly, these operations take on the guise of popular uprisings, with simple symbolism or slogans that mimic grassroots authenticity, but behind the scenes they rely on a steady flow of foreign funds, arms shipments, and strategic counsel that enhance the capacity of discontented groups to challenge governments unfavorable to US interests. The US frequently invokes defense of democracy as a justification for a large chunk of its covert meddling. Disputed elections have become more frequent and are often flashpoints for mass mobilization aided by Western NGOs who provide a wide variety of resources, communication tools, and training to opposition coalitions. The carefully chosen color or brand attempts to give people something to rally around and makes international headlines more impactful and simple. Typical comic book level good versus bad nonsense. These interventions are meant to bypass legitimate institutions. Indigenous political parties, state agencies, constitutional provisions are basically property of the US, which can change anything it wants at will. This is a mechanism for shaping governance structures that accommodate US economic interests and geopolitical priorities, masquerading as democratic discourse. Regime change rarely translates into stable governance for the affected nations. From Libya to Russia, it's either competing militia factions or unending neoliberalism eroding living standards for profit. Frequent, consequence-free intrusions into the internal affairs of independent nations normalizes this interference. When powerful countries repeatedly ignore local institutions and/or international law in the name of democracy, which they themselves don't believe in or even have, rival actors adapt by reinforcing domestic security networks and seek out alternative alliances that only make sense. Governments facing constant threat of sanction or military action heighten surveillance over civil society groups believed to be centers of outside influence. Regional blocs form to deter or resist intervention. Russia's response to encirclement includes forging stronger trade partnerships, such as BRICS, outside of Western dominance. Iran, under decades of sanctions, is almost a BRICS member and has also developed their own parallel financial systems which cultivates alliances with countries similarly alienated by the US specifically and the West in general. Once countries realize this scale of infiltration or manipulation, they immediately try to upgrade their countermeasures, like limiting the reach of foreign NGOs or media outlets. US officials seeking collaboration on trade or security in the future then find their reputation isn't at all what the propaganda would have you believe, precisely due to a long track record of covert operations in these targeted societies. Finally, the usual US claim of promoting human rights and free elections rings pretty hollow when so much evidence points to US agencies orchestrating coups, assassinations, or even genocide. Every time a CIA-backed conspiracy or lethal sabotage mission has been exposed,
Washington's credibility falls further.
With it, a multipolar world rises in its place. Class struggle, however, is always the core contradiction. A better world is possible. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon, it really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Nitro Dubs, Kenny, Thomas Roberts, Nicholas, Owen Baker, T. Wood, Dr. Lemonman, Lumix, Charlie and Eric, Ultimate Turin, Daniel Ethel, The Generic Guy, Santiago Pereira, Rain, Cassandra Corvus, David Fries, Confuse M, Mariana Mastusovic, Robbie Richardson, and Masay Kadro. Thanks for watching.